Hi, I'm Brock.
I'm Jim.
Before we get started, if you want to stay ahead of the cattle markets, sign up for our free daily briefing at herdadvisor.com. It's delivered right to your inbox every morning, 5-minute read. And if you've ever wished you could keep complete cattle records without the clipboard, the Cattle Record Guide lets you enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri, try it free for 14 days at herdadvisor.com.
Welcome back to Cattle Market Guys. I'm Brock, joined as always by Jim, and we've got a full plate for you this Friday wrap. Let's just dive right into the numbers because there's some movement worth talking about. Looking at the 500 to 549 weight steers, we're sitting at $413.45 per hundredweight, and that's down $7.80 from last week. Zoom out to the monthly view, and it's a steeper drop, down $29.30 from where we were back on July 12th.
That's a pretty hard slide for a month's time.
It really is, and the heavier weights aren't escaping it either. The 600 to 649 steers are at $375.86 per hundredweight, down $4.94 week over week, and down $31.15 over the past month. According to the data, volume's been average across both weight classes, so this isn't a thin market anomaly. This is a real trend. The forecast models have the 600 to 649s continuing to slide with a 1-week projection of $368.97 and a 4-week outlook down to $351.38.
Well, that lighter weight class sure has been getting hit too. That's the biggest drop on the board this month.
You're right, and it's worth noting the light steers, that 500 to 549 range, actually has a forecast that bounces around a bit more than the heavier weights. The models show it dipping to around $386 in 2 weeks before ticking back toward $411 in week 3. That kind of volatility tells me there's some uncertainty baked into these lighter weight projections that we don't see on the feeder side. And this all lines up with what the cattle site reported this week. Cattle futures have been edging lower on weak consumer confidence, even as hog futures firmed up a bit. That's a signal worth watching, because when consumer sentiment softens, that's typically a demand story, not a supply story.
Consumer confidence, supply, demand, that's all just fancy talk for whether folks feel like grilling out this weekend or not.
That's basically it in a nutshell. All right, let's move into our first deep dive because there's some real structural stuff happening in the packing sector this week that every producer needs to understand. Beef Magazine reported that Tyson Foods announced they're closing a slaughter and fabrication plant in Joslin, Illinois. And on top of that, they're shuttering a case-ready processing plant out in Eagle Mountain, Utah. This isn't an isolated decision. This continues a broader trend of packing capacity restructuring we've been tracking for a while now.
Every time one of these big plants shuts its doors, somebody's cattle got to find a new home.
Exactly, and that's the concern here. Fewer packing points means less local buying competition, which can put pressure on basis in whatever region loses that capacity. Now, there's actually some better news out of Colorado. The Cargill plant in Fort Morgan had halted slaughter back in April over a pay disagreement, and that dispute locked out more than 1,700 Teamsters Local 455 members starting May 20th. But according to the cattle site, a new 5-year contract agreement was reached on August 17th, and Cargill's set to resume beef production there in September. Jim, this kind of consolidation and labor strife, does it remind you of anything from your years around these plants?
Let me tell you what, it sure does. Back in '87, the packing plant over in Amarillo that my daddy used to haul cattle to just closed its doors overnight. IBP was buying up everything back then, consolidating all that kill capacity into these massive plants up in Nebraska and Kansas. Then not 6 months later, the union boys at one of them big Dakota City plants walked off over a pay dispute, and it backed up cattle for weeks. Feeders around here didn't know where to send their steers, and the basis went haywire because there just wasn't enough buying competition left to keep things honest.
And what happened to prices in that stretch, Jim?
Prices in our region dropped hard because fewer buyers meant less competition at the sale barn. Took the better part of a year for basis relationships to settle back down, and producers had to adjust who they were selling to, sending cattle further than they ever had before.
That's the lesson that keeps repeating itself. When packers consolidate, whether through closures like Tyson's or labor disputes like Cargill's, it's the producer who ends up driving further and taking whatever bids available. Diversifying who you sell to matters more now than maybe any time in recent memory. And speaking of leadership changes in this sector, Beef Magazine also reported that Ellery Frick Brunkhorst has been named president of Frick's Quality Meats. a fifth-generation family member stepping into that role. It's a reminder that even as the big players consolidate and close plants, there's still family-owned regional processors carving out their space in this industry.
Good to see some of these smaller outfits holding steady while the big boys keep shuffling their plants around.
Well said. Let's shift gears into our second deep dive, which is really the macro story behind why we're seeing these price declines across the board. The WASDE report that came out this week from USDA lowered cattle price forecasts for both Q3 and Q4 of 2026, and that lowered outlook actually extends all the way through the end of 2027. CattleRange.com specifically cited weaker than expected demand for fed cattle as the primary driver behind that adjustment.
That's a long runway of lower prices they're talking about.
It is, and it's compounding with what we're seeing in the futures market. The cattle site reported twice this week, both on the 19th and again today on the 21st, that CME live and feeder cattle futures ticked lower on weak consumer confidence and growing doubts over beef demand. What's interesting, though, is that pork cutout values slipped below $99 in that same window, yet hog futures actually firmed up. So we're seeing a bit of a disconnect between the cutout values and where the futures market thinks things are headed for pork, while cattle futures are moving in the same direction as the underlying demand concerns.
Sounds like the market can't make up its mind on protein prices this week.
That's a fair way to put it. Now here's a piece of this puzzle that seems almost counterintuitive at first glance. CattleRange.com also reported that total commercial red meat production is down 2% from last year, with beef, veal, and lamb production all coming in lower, while pork production actually moved higher. Normally, you'd think tighter beef supply would support prices, but when demand concerns are strong enough, even a 2% production decline isn't enough to offset the pressure from the demand side. Jim, what's your take on that?
You know, that's kind of like a windmill spinning steady in a good breeze, but the tank's still running dry underneath it. Don't matter how much water that windmill's pumping if there's a crack draining it out just as fast.
That's a pretty good way to describe it, Jim. Supply's doing its job, but demand's got a leak in it. So for producers, what this means practically is that even with tighter production numbers, you can't count on scarcity alone to prop up your marketing plan right now. You've got to be watching that demand signal just as closely as you're watching your own herd numbers, because right now demand is the story driving this market, not supply.
Words to live by, Brock.
Let's move into our third and final deep dive for today. And this one's all about trade policy and border risk, two things that can turn a stable market upside down almost overnight. The cattle site reported that Canada and the U.S. are racing to avert 50% tariffs before a Wednesday deadline. Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke directly with President Trump trying to hammer out a deal, and the sticking points are around dairy and auto content rules. If they can't get an agreement done in time, we're looking at 50% tariffs kicking in, and that's a massive number for any commodity flow between our two countries.
50%, and that's enough to shut the door on cross-border trade pretty quick.
And speaking of things that can shut a door quick, that's exactly the other half of this story. CattleRange.com reported a new screwworm case discovered in Ciudad Juarez, and that's raising serious questions about resuming livestock imports from Mexico. The focus is intensifying on risk assessment, specifically in the Chihuahua region, for producers who've been watching the Mexican cattle import situation, hoping for that border to fully reopen. This new case is a significant setback to that timeline. Jim, you've seen a border slam shut before, haven't you?
Oh, sure have. Back in 2003, I had a buddy up in Montana who ran cattle that crossed the Canadian line regular as clockwork, buying and selling both ways, no trouble at all. Then that one case of mad cow disease turned up in Alberta, and just like that, the border slammed shut. No warning, no grace period, just done overnight. Feeder prices here in Texas actually jumped for a spell since folks couldn't bring in that Canadian supply anymore. But my buddy's whole business model got turned upside down. Took almost 2 years before that border fully reopened to live cattle again.
What's the big takeaway from that, looking back now?
One animal health scare can close a border faster than any tariff negotiation ever could. Biosecurity risk is the wild card that trumps trade politics every single time. And I think what's happening down in Juarez right now is proof that history's got a way of repeating itself.
That's exactly the risk producers need to be watching right now, because you've got two separate threats moving in parallel. A potential 50% tariff situation with Canada, and a biosecurity concern with Mexico that could delay border reopening even further. Either one of these developments alone would be significant, but together they add a real layer of uncertainty to cross-border cattle flows heading into the fall. My advice for producers is to stay flexible on your marketing plans and don't assume either of these situations resolves quickly, because as Jim's story illustrates, these things can drag on far longer than anyone initially expects.
Amen to that. Keep your options open, because that border is going to reopen on its own schedule, not ours.
Well, that wraps up our week in review for August 21st. Prices trending lower across the board, packing sector consolidation continuing with both closures and resolutions, USDA lowering the long-term outlook, and trade and biosecurity risks both simmering at the border. Jim, always appreciate the historical perspective.
Always glad to be here, Brock. You all have a good weekend and keep watching that tank level, not just the windmill.
We'll see you all next week right here on Cattle Market, guys.
That's all for today. Remember to sign up for our free daily briefing at herdadvisor.com. And if you want complete cattle records without the hassle, try the Cattle Record Guide free for 14 days. Enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri."
Catch you in a couple days.
All right, see you then.